Welcome everyone to the Peace Through Strength webinar brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. As most of you know, and if you don't know, the American Security Council Foundation has been around since 1958, bringing public awareness to the dangers of communism. Specifically, in the 70s and 80s, became very big in the Peace Through Strength Coalition. So we are going to talk on one of the points of Peace Through Strength strategy, and that is global leadership, or U.S. global leadership in the world. And today we're going to discuss the Middle East, specifically focused on the Houthi concern and what's going on in Yemen and the Red Sea and shipping lanes. And Mr. Lawrence Sanford is with us, our senior analyst. He recently wrote a paper titled Houthi War. We've talked quite a bit about the Houthis. So I'm going to turn that over to you, Larry, to give us a little more background on the Houthis in Yemen.
Thank you, Joy. The Houthis are a Shia terror group in the country of Yemen, and they control about 1/3 of the country. And the 1/3 of the country happens to border the Red Sea. And since they are a terrorist group, they're an Islamic terrorist group. Their number one enemy is the great Satan, the United States, and the little Satan, Israel. And they recently started missile attacks, drone attacks against Western shipping in their support of Gaza and Hamas against Israel. They're using the excuse to attack Western shipping because they support Israel. And the Houthis are supplied by Iran as far as sophisticated missiles and drone technology, which ultimately most of it comes from China. So China's got its fingers in this war. Iran has got their fingers in this war. And since the Houthis are Shia Muslims, they have the religious affinity also with Iran, which is Shia, as opposed to the central government in Yemen, which is Sunni. And the Sunnis are the religion of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and most of the Arab world are Sunni. But in any event, the Houthis have launched at least 170 missile drone attacks against the U.S. ships, including the U.S. Navy ships, and have basically created havoc as far as worldwide shipping patterns are concerned. The Red Sea is the approach to the Suez Canal. And by shooting down ships or shooting at ships in the Red Sea, they have forced the diversion of Western shipping around South Africa, which adds 2 to 3 weeks and thousands and thousands of dollars in fuel costs and time tied up and everything else. Conspicuously speaking, Chinese and Russian ships have not been attacked by the Houthis. And the reason is that the Russians and the Chinese have an affinity with the Islamism against Israel. And also from China's viewpoint, they get a significant portion of their oil, not only from Russia, but from the Middle East. And the Russians are shipped through the Suez Canal, but their ships are coming from the north to the south, providing oil to India, China, and other countries through their gray ghost fleet of tankers. So the Chinese are shipping their product up to the Suez Canal from south to north into the Mediterranean to Europe. The Russians are shipping their oil down through the Suez Canal to ports everywhere. And Western ships are being attacked, and the West doesn't seem to be doing anything about it except the United States. And yet the vast majority of Western shipping through the Suez Canal was destined for Europe, not so much the United States. Relatively speaking, the Suez Canal is not a major issue with the United States. But in any event, it's an intrusion on freedom of the seas, and one would think that the world would be united in this blatant act of piracy and barbarism of shooting down ships. But like everything else in the Middle East, history intrudes itself on many areas of this whole conflict. And the central government of Yemen has been unable to squash the rebellion of the Houthis, and Saudi Arabia was aiding them, but Saudi Arabia has backed off, one, because the United States under President Biden sort of said, don't interfere. And also because the Houthis started shooting missiles at the Saudi oil facilities. Egypt, where a significant source of their foreign exchange comes from the Suez Canal tolls, has seen a significant drop in money, and yet they're not doing anything because they're afraid of the Arab street mobs uprising if they are seen in support of aiding Israel vis-a-vis stopping the Houthis from shooting at ships. So the United Nations can't do anything about it, or won't do anything about it, because China and Russia veto any resolutions against the Houthi attacks. So now it's up to the United States and the West to do something about it. And since basically Western Europe is a paper tiger with no capabilities militarily to do anything about it, it's falling upon the United States to do something in regards to air power. And President Biden started to attack the missile sites and the drone sites of the Houthis, but it's a pinprick thing and it's not going to stop this thing as long as the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians continue to supply the technology and arms to the Houthis. The unlimited airstrikes aren't going to work. We all remember World War II wasn't due to airstrikes, it was due to ground troops. In Vietnam, the U.S. dropped more bombs in Vietnam than they did in World War II, and yet what happened there? You need troops on the ground, and it was only near the end of the Vietnam War that the United States started going after ships in Haiphong Harbor, and that seemed to have some effect. And so the only way that this thing is going to be resolved is troops on the ground in Houthi-controlled Yemen, which means the central government has to get its act together, and recent reports are indicating they're amassing an army of 80 to 90,000 men to go after the Houthi-controlled territory of Yemen and bring it under control. Apparently, Egypt and Saudi Arabia are also going to contribute in what way is not known at this time, but the United States is helping the central government. And the only way it's going to work is if the U.S. Air Force and Navy control the skies and do the precise bombing that they're so capable of. But without troops on the ground, nothing is going to change. And the other thing that has to be done is the United States has to stop all shipping into all the ports controlled by the Houthis. And this will lead to a worldwide uprising, because now people in Yemen will face food shortages, medical shortages, because if the ports are stopped and closed to shipping, then nothing's going to come into the country. And they're very dependent upon outside food and other supplies. And the other player in this thing is Oman, their next door neighbor to Yemen. And generally speaking, they're a pro-Western government. But apparently they have an attitude of, the Houthis can operate here, Hamas can operate here. So they're sort of like a Qatar. They claim to be friends of the West, but at the same time, they're friends with the Houthis and the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth. So we have to stop at the Oman border, where products shipped through the border into Yemen. So if we shut down the ports and we shut down the Yemen border with Oman, then there's a good chance we can help supplies dry up. But until we can stop the supplies from drying up, this thing could drag on forever. And the only answer is the troops on the ground. And if that does not happen, there will be no stopping the occasional, if not regular, shipments of missiles and drones from Iran and China into Yemen, Houthi-controlled areas. And the missiles will continue to be fired at Western shipping until something is done. One would hope that Western Europe would contribute more since they're so dependent. One would hope that the United Nations would do something. One would hope that the world in general would do something, but I wouldn't bet on it. So until the central government gets its act together and goes after the Houthis, the missiles will continue and worldwide shipping will be affected. And it's not a good situation.
No, thank you, Larry. Appreciate that. And as a global leadership, that's peace and democracy and human rights from that standpoint. The only democratic partner, as you pointed out before, we have over there is Israel at the moment.
Yes.
Hope there was some hope maybe for Tunisia, but I don't think so at the present time. Maybe Lebanon might come along. We'll have to see how that draws.
Well, I'm a firm believer, Joy, in reciprocity. And, we send billions of dollars to Egypt. We send all sorts of stuff to Saudi Arabia. And who knows what we're sending to Yemen? Well, I do know. We send hundreds of millions of dollars to the central government of Yemen. My feeling is if they don't support us, why should we support them? So I think reciprocity, okay, Egypt, you gotta do something to help us stop these missile attacks and open up the Red Sea so that your Suez Canal can go back to making some money for yourself. So,
I agree. And in fact, that's one of the questions we had is, do you see Egypt getting involved since they're losing, as you said, money from the shipping lanes, and because the U.S. really does send them quite a bit of money?
there are indications. I recently read some reports where Egypt and Saudi Arabia are gearing up to help the central government of Yemen. And I think the reciprocity formula that Trump is using in tariffs is also applying in foreign aid as opposed to USAID. So what Trump did with the USAID is he said, we're sending out money and we're not getting anything in reciprocity. So let's take a look at this whole program. So I think reciprocity is beginning to be a major factor in U.S. foreign policy, which it should be. If you're acting against the United States, why should we send you a nickel? I have never understood why we send a penny to the Palestinian organizations. They hate America. They hate Western civilization. Money will not buy love, at least in this case.
That's a good point. And on that point, this is not a question, but more of my comment on this. It looks like, as you mentioned, if we were able to close down the Yemeni ports, we're going to have a humanitarian crisis, as we saw happen before. When Saudi Arabia was involved down there. Yeah. And there was a world outcry. So the same situation, we look at Gaza.
Yep.
If we do something there, we have a humanitarian situation and world outcry.
Yep.
But if something's not done, there's no peace.
No, that's right. So the humanitarian crisis is to let the cancer continue unchecked. And yes, if in the case of Gaza, for example, if the people wanted Hamas, they're paying the price for wanting Hamas, and it's up to them to do something about Hamas. And I would say the same thing in Yemen. The Yemeni has to take care of the problem with our assistance. No, I have no issues with that, but I certainly have an issue of American troops being involved. There's some talk about U.S.-backed mercenary forces. I've always believed in mercenaries, and I think Russia has proven that mercenary forces can be very useful as an instrument of foreign policy, and they're having a great impact in Africa in particular, but they've also got their fingers in South America, and who knows where else. But mercenaries prevent the U.S. troop angle of foreign intervention coming along. So the mercenaries could serve a purpose. And Eric Prince, the Blackwater founder.
Yeah, I was going to say a shout out to Eric Prince. So, hey,
yeah. But the problem with mercenaries from an American viewpoint, if you're an American, is you might be okay under Trump, but if you get somebody in like AOC, then you'll probably end up going to jail for the work you do, because Blackwater ended up at the end of the wrong stick of certain people in Congress.
Yeah, unfortunately. And I was going to say, to that point, the U.S. has used mercenaries like Blackwater so successfully in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Iraq, I believe, as well.
Yeah, it was Iraq. Yeah, that's where the whole thing blew up on the whole Blackwater thing.
So we'll see how that maybe develops. That's an interesting take. But so another question, and I think you kind of answered, would Saudi Arabia return to the fight against the Shia Houthis?
Well, and again, it's in their long-term interest, and they're gonna participate if they think they can get away with it. But if they're gonna have rockets fired at their oil facilities and no hope of resolution, then I say they're gonna back off. But they seem to be a very practical government and looking after Saudi interests. And certainly, if you're a Saudi, long-term Shia Yemen Houthis are not in your interest.
And maybe with US, now knowing US is going after the Houthis with this administration and the possibility of the Sunni government troops on the ground, that would be more compelling for them to join.
Yeah. I mean, they took a hiatus during President Biden's term. I mean, Trump's first term, he labeled the Houthis a terrorist group. Biden comes in and unlabels them and sort of admonishes the Saudis for supporting the central government of Yemen, backing off all the humanitarian crisis, the people starving. Trump has redesignated them as a terror group, so maybe this will give some backbone to the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the central government. Let's hope so, because we're wasting our time and money by having Navy aircraft carriers out there firing ships, firing at the missile sites on the coast. And I would say in this day and age, carriers have to be very, very careful. With the technology and missiles nowadays developed in China and Iran, and we've seen what's happened to the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, missiles and drones can inflict serious damage on surface ships, and aircraft carriers are big surface ships. And one of these days, if they keep on firing missiles and drones, they might get lucky. And all it takes is one lucky shot, and you've got an aircraft carrier of 6,000 or 7,000 men and women, $15 billion worth of equipment and planes, and heavily damaged or sunk. So there's a whole new dimension to the world. And it's not Vietnam, where there was carriers floating all over the place, or Afghanistan, where we had all sorts of assets floating around. This is the day and age of missiles, and the whole world of wars are changing. And we're seeing a preview of this in Ukraine, what drones and missiles have done.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm a big proponent of modernized warfare, and that's another peace through strength strategy of combat readiness, which
Yes.
So, and actually that brings up a question I pose. So we know we have a base in Djibouti. Instead of using a carrier, could we not use the base and long-range drones or even our fighter jets?
Good question, Joy. I don't know what the terms are of our legal lease in Djibouti, but I would also note that right down the street, I think almost within sight of each other, is a Chinese military base.
They are.
The only military base the Chinese have overseas, actually. But there's also things happening in the Horn of Africa. You have Somali, and you have versus Somaliland. One would think that we might be able to make a deal. And I think Somalia has offered the U.S. use of their ports and help in the fight against Al-Shabaab. So it's a moving target. You have Eritrea and Sudan. There's all sorts of stuff going on over there in that part of the world.
Yes, I heard a lot of the Middle East countries were vying for, even Russia, I believe, vying for a port on Sudan.
Yes.
Coastline there. But I did hear talk of us also working with Somali to possibly put up in a port and maybe have a recognition of a Somaliland. So I don't know how that's going to play out. But
I know it's moving, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. So another question, as you said, the U.S. really has not been successful at stopping the Houthis from firing missiles at ships in the Red Sea. Will this require negotiations with Iran to stop supplying the Houthis? And will these negotiations work along with the recent nuclear talks we've been having?
I would love to. I always prefer talk to war. But talking to the mullahs of Iran so far hasn't worked. And, you know, they haven't changed their mantra of death to America, death to Israel, and Islam is going to conquer the world type of thing. So the mullahs are a different breed. They might want to talk just to get some breathing space, because the U.S. sanctions are having an impact on their economy, and the natives are getting a little restless, and the mullahs have to be worried about not only the U.S. but internal issues of lack of water. Water is a huge issue in Iran. The rivers and wells are drying up. Their aquifer systems have been drained big time for support the agricultural sector, and so they have some internal problems. And within Iran, the Persians the Farsi speakers are about 65% of the population. So that means 35% of the Iranian population are not native Persians. There's the Azeris, there's the Balukas, there's Christians, there's Syrians, there's Arabs. So there's all sorts of other ethnic groups within Iran who don't necessarily like the Persians. So they have all sorts of internal issues. And one would argue that eventually the present mullah will die, and let's hope the new one will be a little more amenable to opening up. But we'll see. I mean, if the mullahs continue to rule, then I don't see any hope for any real long-term peace.
We'll have to keep an eye on that internal conflict because that could help situations, negotiations there. And speaking of China, as we did talk about Djibouti and China supplying, well, certainly they're giving money to Iran in exchange for oil, as you said, and allowed to pass through the Red Sea without an issue, as well as Russia.
Yes.
It's a question, how does China's role play in this? And can the tariffs be a leverage to stop China from sending weapons to Iran and onto their proxies?
Well, the Chinese will say one thing and do another thing. So if it's in their interest to continue to supply weapons, they'll figure out a way to do it. Again, the only way to really solve the problem is for troops on the ground. The Chinese will continue to their goal of reducing the impact of America throughout the world. And as you know, they're waging unrestricted warfare against the United States, and they're waging it in every way they can through every organization under their control. And Iran and Russia and North Korea and China, they're all working together for the same purpose. And so China will figure out a way to keep on supplying materials and technologies to Iran or Russia, if it means assisting them against the United States. So the United States is facing a basket of enemies. And it's imperative that we maintain our alliances as best we can in this day and age of Trump's tariff wars, which I can understand tariffs against China. I'm not so sure I agree with his tariffs against Canada and Mexico and allies. So tariffs are taxes. They don't do any good to anybody. But reciprocity is an issue too. So if we have Germany shipping Mercedes to the United States at 3% tariff, and we ship a Cadillac to Germany, we have a 25% tariff, then I say there should be some negotiations about reciprocity.
Well, thank you, Larry. I appreciate your talk and question and answer time.
Thank you, Joy.
And to our listeners, please join us for the next podcast. It's going to be part 2 on the Middle East, and we are going to have a special guest, Pete McIllwain. Thank you. I always get that one mixed up. May 8th is a Thursday. We're going to switch over to Thursdays at this point at 2 o'clock, same time, but Thursdays we believe might be a better time for people to join in. If not, you can always catch up the webinars as we send them out on social media. But please join us with our special guest. He's going to touch on the Middle East and specifically Turkey situation and their hand in Syria and what's going on in the Middle East as well. And then for June, we have another very special guest. The Middle East Forum is going to join us. And they do have people over in the Middle East that send in good reports. So this will be an interesting topic as well. So thank you again to Larry.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you to our listeners, and join us again next time for our Peace Through Strength webinar. Happy Easter, everyone.